Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for your readings, of course. They were really good, as expected. Just so everyone knows who I am, and I'm just not just a random stranger on the stage. I'm Naomi. I'm a college student. I'm majoring in journalism. I'm an alum of the 92NY. I used to be an intern here at the Poetry Center, so this is really important to me. I'm Haitian. I'm from Harlem, born and raised, and I would also consider myself a writer. And just like you were talking about all the identities that you have. So I was wondering, when you started to consider yourself a poet, we know that you're queer, you're Cuban, and you're an engineer. So how did you balance all of that?
Well, I think, growing up in Miami was a special circumstance too, because you don't realize you're really different because most everybody's like you. 98% of my class was Cuban American like me and had similar stories of exile. But I think it happened right about early 20s when you start asking yourself that big question, where am I from? What is this Cuba that my parents are talking about? Am I really Cuban? Am I really American? What does all that mean? And I think that's sort of a natural way that we mature. But also, like I sort of referred to earlier, it was writing that sort of really got me to deepen and think about those questions and navigate through those questions. In fact, I think it was partly writing and imagining myself as another person, another identity that actually gave me the courage to also sort of live my life, come out and live my life as a gay man. So I say that it all, writing, as I said earlier, writing makes me think and thinking makes me write. I think it came hand in hand and sort of the timing of it happened that way. And it's become my life's work to think about these multiplicities, also their intersection, and what does all that mean. And I'm still discovering what that means, right? We never get to a final point where I am this, right?
I definitely get that, especially because I'm first gen and my parents are Haitian, and even though they immigrated here a while ago, they still talk about Haiti as if they're there right now. And I've always had to balance if I have a slight accent when I speak Creole, does that make me any less Haitian? But also growing up in Harlem, I'm Black culture is my culture at the same time, and you're being perceived as that as well. So I think balancing that and using writing to balance that has really helped me a lot too. Growing up, that's all I write about.
And your generation, the fluidity of so many other ways of how you weave in and out of these spaces, which I think my generation is more landlocked, so to speak, right? But there's so many different experiences that you negotiate, and happily so, I think. I think there's a great joy in loving that as well.
Yeah, even for me, it's kind of hard to explain that fluidity, especially to my parents. When I'm writing stuff, a lot of it is pretty abstract, so they don't really understand it. And then they read it, and they're like, what are you talking about? And I'm there's not really a way for me to explain it, but I think the fact that I'm able to express that is really important to me,
Certainly.
One thing that really did interest me is that you're an engineer, and for me, I literally, no offense, but I hate STEM things. I'm so bad at math. I'm really bad at science. And I was just wondering, is engineering a passion for you in the same way that writing is? Or is it more you wanted to please other people, but also to please yourself in the sense that you got a degree for that?
Right. Well, I think that had to do with my my circumstances. So as a working class immigrant kid, and also like you were saying, that sort of cultural divide, or not necessarily cultural divide, but a different understanding. I mean, my parents were from rural Cuba. They didn't understand the possibility of the arts, and not that they denied it to me, but it just wasn't dinner table conversation. But also, what little they knew of arts was really they're Cuban artists and they're Cuban poets and whatnot. So there was a divide there. My grandmother, as you heard, at one time I wanted to study architecture, and she said, that's too gay. And so my grandmother sort of put a wall on some of the things that were available to me. So that influenced a lot of why I became an engineer. But I'm still to this day one of those kids that loves everything. I'm left brain, right brain. And so I was really great at math. And for those reasons, I studied engineering, always knowing that I had a creative side. I didn't know when that would happen or how it would happen. If you would have told me at 23 or 24 that I was going to be a poet, I would have laughed in your face. But what happened in engineering, when I started working in my consultant office, half my job was writing. And you don't realize this, right? Those people that study science that think they're never going to write, I'm like, guess what? So writing reports and studies, and most importantly, proposals for the firm. And if you got a $40 million, if you were awarded a $40 million job because of your proposal, which is really a narrative of your vision for the project, guess who gets the raise? Guess who gets the promotion? But anyways, I started geeking out on language and thinking, this is so cool. And I'm really excelling at my job because of writing. And then then that right brain kicked in and said, hey, weren't you going to do something creative? Like, I thought, yeah, what do I know nothing about? Poetry. Let's start writing poetry. And so I started writing really bad poetry, and eventually went to a community college, took a class, and sort of eventually really started loving it. But I never considered replacing one with the other. To me, they're both important in my life. I mean, ever since serving as presidential inaugural poet, that was obviously a game changer, so I haven't practiced engineering. But I do try to reach out and speak at a lot of engineering schools and let them understand the importance of the humanities and writing, that they can't just be, one-dimensional in science. And ultimately, I've realized that only maybe a couple years ago, because I was still like, yeah, why are you a poet? I think I never remember not knowing 2 languages. So I remember in New York City, when I was here when I was 4 or 5 years old, I remember translating words for my parents. And I think that imprinted in me this fascination with language and understanding that language, I didn't take it for granted that it was just a form of communication, but that it was power. When you're telling your parents how to say something at 5 years old, that it was power, there was a way of thinking about the world and breathing about the world. So I think when that opportunity to do something creative came in, naturally language was part of that. And then one more little thing is, a lot of times, sometimes the narrative is, in some people's mind, is that I was forced to study engineering, and then I discovered poetry, and the clouds parted, and I found my true calling in life, and the cherubs came down and took me away to poetry land. And I always like to say, yeah, I really wanted to go into poetry full time because there's so much money in it. But in reality, there was a practical choice to that too. I had to earn a living as a way of feeding my addiction, so to speak, for poetry.
That reminds me of my brother. He actually started off as an engineering major too, and then he's actually graduating on Friday with an art history degree.
Yeah.
And it's not that he doesn't like engineering, and he still loves math and science, but I think he just feels more connected towards art history. He's always loved museums, but at the same time, his favorite museums are the science museums. So it's like, I'm glad that he's able to balance that too, and I think I'm trying to figure out how to balance my different interests in my life too.
It's another kind of fluidity, which, again, your generation has the privilege of, but also it can be very confusing, right? But why can't we do several things? Especially, I mean, you're going to live to like 120 years old. Do you think you can be doing the same thing from this age, from college on? So I think it's important. And even if you don't lead it as a career, always having something other that you do sort of balances you and actually informs the one thing that you kind of do. So just to be, even if you're an engineer, to be in, like I always like to say, I'm a better engineer because I'm a poet, and actually a better poet because I'm an engineer, I think.
So that just made me think of like your mindset towards poetry is really different. It's not like necessarily something you need, but something you're kind of feeding. And I wonder, like, I know that you're a professor, so I was wondering, how do you instill that in your students as well, for them to know that you don't have to necessarily be a poet, you could love it, you could love something else, but to involve that in your life regardless?
Well, I teach undergraduate, so that's part of like what I think my charge is, because I'm not there to make them poets, all of them. You got to study poetry, or else that's the only thing you can do. I offer, like here, I offer my life story, and realizing that I've also had to make practical choices, and also understand that the humanities, not just poetry, but being in tune with the humanities at the end of the day makes us a better, more aware human being. And that's going to make you a better doctor or lawyer or engineer or teacher or sibling, right? I mean, you're too young to go to doctors, but but you ever had those doctors that have no bedside manner? It's a lack of humanities. And so I'll tell them there's something really very practical that you can take from this class besides learning how to write a decent poem, is that you're going to look at the world differently no matter where you are and what you do. And I think, again, that makes for a better world. And it's unfortunate that the humanities are becoming, have been downplayed now, because I think that's the key to any really great anything, right?
Yeah, I think that ties back into your whole idea of intersectionality, fluidity. I guess it's just more of a way of living. We all have different interests, but we also just have different things that we can learn. And also, maybe just because I like writing, but I also very much support people loving the humanities and things like that. But yeah, I think it's really important to touch on, because especially now with like a lot of AI and STEM, I think people are losing that. Like, even for me, I was told to major in computer science, and like, again, it's not only that I'm bad at those things, but I genuinely like just don't like them. So I think it's really interesting to just tell people to keep those interests alive, if anything.
Definitely. Yeah, anything that you learn in some ways is never lost, right? It comes back in some ways to inform some kind of success in your life.
Yeah, eventually it will.
Yeah.
One last question on my part that I was really wondering is why Homeland of My Body is the title of your book. I know it kind of represents like the message of it, but it's not the last poem in the book. So was that intentional, or did it just happen?
Every book is different, and this is a particularly different book because it's a new and selected, so it's not just a collection. But it's one of those moments where I just had the title from the beginning, and I was like, this is the title of the book. I hadn't even written the poem. I thought of the title as to set my thematic sort of, my mind on a sort of theme that I wanted to explore new poems, obviously. It just stuck. And then I wrote the poem actually because I got to have a poem by the title, right? But for me, I think, again, that search for home, it also got a little tiring, right? Because that constant search, one thing I didn't mention earlier was that search for home is also in a way driven by an ego, that I have to be happy, I have to live in the perfect place, I have to and realizing that, to use a cliche, right? Home is where the heart is, and it's just like it's in me. And to tell you the truth, the book is so new because it's like a new baby that sometimes the poems keep on teaching me, the book keeps on teaching me. But yeah, I was kind of tired of chasing that home, that physical home, and just I found some tentative or temporary peace in knowing that it's all with me.
I actually love that. I also sometimes write like titles before I write the poem.
Oh yeah.
And I just think it ends up coming together eventually. But yeah, I just like the fact that you did it out of order. I didn't expect that, but yeah. I mean, it worked out anyway.
Yeah.
So right now we're going to go to the student questions. We received a lot of them from the participating high schools, and we wish we could read them all, but we did pick out a few to read. So we're going to start with the Riverdale Kingsbridge Academy with Theodora.
Hi, my name is Theodora. My question is, many of your poems, including Why I Need To, convey a strong sense of emotion and vulnerability. What role do you think vulnerability plays in your approach to writing your poems and your creative process?
Sure. So it's really interesting because poems do come across as like this incredibly transparent, sort of raw and whatnot. And I always tell my students that art begins in that kind of vulnerability. But at the end of the day, it's really because you're making art, it transforms some self-expression into art. And so this part of the reason it's my process, but part of the reason I'm addicted to writing poetry is that I always discover something different or new, or go into a poem thinking one thing or feeling one thing and realizing the emotion's quite complex and maybe sometimes even the opposite. I'm not angry, I'm sad, So it's the beauty of the art that also lets me transcend the very raw stuff that I come to the poem with. And in some ways, then I don't feel vulnerable because it's kind of like the equivalent sometimes of, like a painter may create a painting that has blood, sweat, and tears in it, but now it's a painting on the wall, right? And it's, as we like to say in poetry also, once we finish a poem, it's no longer ours. And so it's a fine balance, right? Like there's this, but I always tell my students it has to begin with that raw stuff. Otherwise, there's no oomph. Sometimes I tell them writing a poem is the stupidest, most arrogant, self-serving thing you can do in the world, but also at the same time the most gregarious, selfless thing, because you're giving to the world, and people hopefully will see themselves in you putting forth that experience, that journey, that emotional journey.
Thank you.
I actually love the idea of a poem being given to someone else, and I think that is going to help me share my poems, because I definitely just like to keep them in my notes app by myself.
Yeah, yeah, and it helps you get over the fear of sometimes exposing myself. No, you're making art, and that's gonna sort of connect with someone in a way that that's not about your own transparency.
For sure. So our second question, also from Riverdale Kingsbridge Academy, we have Sienna.
Hi, my name is Sienna. My question is, how is writing poems a helpful way of expressing your feelings, figuring out your thoughts, and talking about your past and present?
Well, similar, right? And similar to the other question, but I'll add a few things to that. So, Anais Nin, a writer more than a poet, said famously, "Writers taste life twice." And so for me, that's part of the reason I write, is that we go over those emotions. You ever remember those things that you remember from something that happened when 5 years old that you keep on remembering? Like I was, those things that have stuck with us. Well, the artist bothers to go back and investigate those, right? And learn something about themselves, about the people in their life, about the world. So I kind of follow that. That's part of what motivates me to write a poem, is to go back through those fine details, to take that little poems sometimes are little time machines where you can immerse yourself and see what that moment really meant and how it's affected you all your life. I'll give you really a straightforward example. Like my writing about my grandmother has let me really reanalyze my relationship with her. And while you see that poem, she's obviously verbally abusive, but she's also in a weird way loving, right? She wants to watch out for me. She wants, in that generation, she's afraid of perhaps how I will be treated. So what she's really asking me to do in that poem is to just, act straight, right? So that I won't be hurt. It's weird, but I would have never realized if I didn't through the poem, step into her psychology. And however weird or twisted that love was, it was much more loving than I thought it was. And it helped me to get through some of the pain of that trauma. It helped me rethink it.
I definitely like that example. It's like you have a new understanding of your life. And I think that's, for me, not necessarily I'm searching for understanding, but I guess just to close it off and I guess seal that memory for myself.
Yeah, transcend it in a way and see it and put it on the shelf, so to speak. And there it is. And then you move on to the next thing.
All right, so we have our third question from Academy of American Studies, Julian.
Hi, my name is Julian. My question is, which poet or poets do you derive inspiration from for your writing?
So there's several. I think, of course, a lot of the Latinx poets like especially Sandra Cisneros, who allowed me to open the door for me to write my story. When I first started writing poems, I thought I had to write like dead British white guys, right? And I was writing about daffodils while I was living in Miami, thinking that was poetry. So House of Mango on Mango Street, which many of you may probably have read, really open. It was like, wait, I get to tell my story? That's what poetry is? So that's definitely one person. And the whole pantheon of them, Julia Alvarez, Martín Espada. But then one of my other more influential, on the opposite of that spectrum, is Elizabeth Bishop. And one would think Elizabeth Bishop died in 1975, so she's not even from my generation. But she was also born in Worcester, Massachusetts, which I can hardly pronounce, much less spell. She was a quintessential New England grande dame lady, writer, poet. What the hell does she have in common with Richard Blanco? And what I found in her work is that she was orphaned when she was 4 years old, and she was looking for home always in some ways, in a different way than I was. And I kind of trust that, even though some of you, may not think, you're not caught in perhaps a cultural identity sort of negotiation. Really, the idea of home is figurative, right? We're all trying to find home in some way. And so reading her and connecting with her made me feel, well, if I can see myself in Elizabeth Bishop, someone who's so distant, right, autobiographically, certainly someone like Elizabeth Bishop should be hopefully see themselves in my story, and realizing that across art we really sort of learn to communicate despite the specifics of our lives. So in some ways, it was more powerful for me to see myself in Elizabeth Bishop than to see myself in Latino poets, because I expected to see myself in them. But they're still my pantheon. But I always like to, as readers, understand that it's also good to read. It's great to read within the context of experiences that relate to you, but it's also important to read outside of those, because there's something magical that happens when you realize the human condition is the human condition, right?
Thank you.
For our next question, also from Academy of American Studies, we have Danica.
Hi, my name is Danica, and I have two questions, actually. So my first is, what is your writing process? And my second one is, why is poetry your preferred medium of writing?
Okay, great. So the writing process, that's a good question, but I will preface my answer by saying that each one of our processes is different, and I imagine you're a writer, or that you'll be asking that question, and part of your journey as a writer is to find the process that works for you. Part of your journey is to ask this question, but also to find your own process. My process is a little chaotic. I equate it, or analogous to me, as like sort of almost like writing music, where I'm just throwing words on a page, like throwing Jello on the wall to see what sticks. And I'm kind of like going through this process of really divorcing that everyday language, that the expected language, and trying to find that inner voice through something happens at some point. There's an image or phrase or something happens where suddenly I recognize, oh, that's Richard the poet, not Richard the guy that has to change the cat litter every day, right? And I'm able to trust the poem and enter that world. And then from then, I start crafting it more carefully, or thinking about form and structure. Is this a sonnet? Is this going to be a free verse poem? What is the core of this poem? What am I looking for? What's the emotional core? So all those sorts of things. But I will caution you, a poem isn't linear. It's iterative. So I may get to like advance it, I'm like really happy with it, and then I'll hit another wall, and then I'll have to go back into that creative process. The poem moves forward a little bit and sort of falls back into a stump or a wall. So it's kind of, it's not like this, it's kind of a loop, that starts happening. So that's part of my process, but again, everybody's process is a little different. I feel sometimes, as I said, the music analogy, I feel like I'm just sort of picking at the guitar strings until I hear that right, chord or that right, notes, and then, okay, that's the song. It's not done yet. It's hardly done, but it allows me. And then the second question was?
Why is poetry your preferred medium?
I think it has to do with being fascinated with language, like I was saying earlier, from a very young age, and poetry is the essence of language. But also, I've always thought in impressions. Since I was a kid, like I've always seen a world in like an image. I think if you made me write a novel, I'd wither and die. As I like to say, I have too many characters in my head to start making other characters. I don't necessarily like storytelling, although my poems are narrative. They're still poems, right? So I don't know, I've just never been interested in that. And I think because I was a poor reader, because we didn't have books in my house. I grew up without any books. The books we had was eventually an encyclopedia. That was what I would read. I went to a very poor parish, Catholic parish. There's no art. So I'm just a poor reader. Like my attention span for reading is really short. And so the poem always gave me that immediate kind of like a song, right? Like I can read this and in 10 minutes walk away with something. So that's all those things sort of influenced. But I've wanted to run away from poetry, but I'm a poet.
Thank you.
From Harvest Collegiate High School, we have Phoenix.
You got a couple more?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Phoenix. My question is, how can poetry inspire young adults who live in an unpoetic and unromantic world?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Also, talk about Homeland of My Body. I realized I'm losing my hearing last week.
My question is, how can poetry inspire young adults who live in an unpoetic and unromantic world?
How can poetry inspire young adults? Well, I think, I mean, first of all, I think poetry can inspire anybody, right? But I think, especially in the complex world that it's usually the other way around, right? Where adults are always saying like, well, you have it so good, you know, oh, we were complicated, we went uphill, you know, in the snow 10 miles to go to school. I kind of feel the opposite. I kind of feel that the world that you're all negotiating is much more complex and much more fluid than the world I had. And so I think poetry, the arts in general, but poetry, you're going to find voices that are speaking to some of the same issues, and young voices too. I mean, we have so many poets in this country, and not just what you're going through, but also even in your own communities. So I think the arts in general, but poetry in this case, in this context in particular, gives us a little bit of a blueprint. But it also, like I was saying earlier, I think poetry, you find empathy for yourself when you see someone else talking and processing what you process. So I think that is so uplifting, right? You realize you're not alone, right? So I think that's all important. And again, even if you're not, you know, trying to be a poet or becoming a poet, look at the arts, look at poetry. These are ways the writers, and the arts have a unique way of connecting us to ourselves that you're not going to get from computer science.
Okay, thank you.
Also, with the whole idea of there's so many different types of poetry, you just have to find which one connects to you. I think just look towards it and you'll find something that inspires you for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I always say this to folks, like some people are like, oh, I don't get poetry. And I'm like, well, when was the last time you wrote a poem? Oh, I haven't read a poem in 30 years. Or the idea is, I always tell them, like, just because you watched a movie and you didn't understand it or didn't like it, do you say, oh, I don't understand movies? Like, there's so many different kinds of poetry as there are so many different kinds of music. They're just finding a handful of voices that speak to you, and then you are reading poetry. You do get poetry.
We have Owen from Harvest Collegiate High School.
I'm actually Owen's substitute, Finn. Owen is not here today. Very, very upsetting. My question is, how do you get over the fear of being perceived through your writing?
Sure. Well, I think it had to do a little bit about that dynamic of feeling that you're that you're being exposed or that you're being judged. I think again, it happens. There's something unique that happens when, as an artist, right? I mean, there's a fine line. Art begins in self-expression, right? Like I said, it should. But at some point, it migrates or it transforms into something that's no longer, in a way, me. Like, it's a version of me. It's something that I can look at now. And so I don't feel exposed, but I can see that those first early stages are, because we're also uncovering a lot of stuff. I think you just have to trust the process that making art is going to lead you to this great space. And when you're in that better space, then you feel freer to share it. But also sharing it with people, like in live. This is like when I began today, like, I mean, I'm not going to probably be able to connect with all of you personally here, but sometimes in book signings, people will tell you stories about that poem that you wrote made me think about X, Y, or Z, and then I know that also uplifts you because you realize people aren't looking at you like, oh my God, that happened to you. No, it's more like, oh my God, that happened to me, right? And in much more traumatic contexts and experiences. And so that also bolsters you and says, you know what, this isn't about being exposed, it's really about people connecting to who they are because of art, and art becomes the bridge between us.
Thank you.
I'm the same way. Every time I send like someone else a poem I wrote, or honestly anything I wrote, I just ask them to what they think it means. And honestly, that's better than them always knowing what I'm thinking. But the fact that they're able to at least relate to one part of it is fine with me.
Right.
And from our last school, Cambria Heights Academy, we have Nye.
Hi.
Right.
Hi, my name is Nye, and my question to you is, how do you decide on the format for each poem?
How do I decide on what?
The format.
So that again comes through play, right? So sometimes you start looking for patterns, and this is where I feel like, poetry, math has helped in poetry. Like they say, music is very mathematical. You're looking for units of units of how the poem is happening. For example, it might be something as simple as like, okay, I'm doing 4-line stanzas. Now that's not a form, right? But it's a structure, right? And you're starting to think, and then suddenly I can't write that 4-line stanza. I can only think, and I realize that's the turn in the poem. So matter, I start looking for those kinds of internal structures. There's other kinds of things, like the poem about my grandmother, for example. I first wrote it in first person, like talking about her, right? And all the things she said. But when I looked at the poem, I realized that I was feeling that as a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old. And the poem came across like I was whining. In a weird way, it was like, you're an adult, why are you complaining about this, right? And maybe because I had started to process that trauma or pain already. And so I decided, what if I just turned it into my grandmother's voice? So, and then now she comes across, I'm just giving her to you, I'm giving the experience through her eyes, which becomes very different. And telling us like night and day what those two poems are different. So you're constantly looking for opportunities. So it's form, it's also structure, it's also, gosh, there's so many things, right? It's like, what color do I pick next? And this is where we're going, practicing, and obviously I got a degree in creative writing, that you have those tools available. But it's really about always being present and looking for those opportunities and also willing to abandon them at any time, right? Like say, this is not working. And like with the grandmother poem, I'm going to try something different. So it's really exploring and being on the edge all the time, which I love because otherwise things would be really boring, right? A friend of mine, artist, painter, once said to me, to be an artist is to be something that does not exist yet, and that is very exciting, right? Okay. And scary.
Thank you.
All right, so.
Good answer, eh? What happened?
For our last question, also from Cambria Heights Academy, we have Jaden.
Hi, my name is Jadon. My question is, do you still visit Cuba, and what is Cuba like?
So I first visited Cuba in 1994. As I was saying, that was an amazing experience. I should say that my mother, my whole mother's side of the family stayed behind in Cuba. So I grew up with literally half a family. And my mother has 8 brothers and sisters, and she's the youngest of 8. So she has like nieces, dozens of nieces and nephews. Some of them are even older than her. So it was like this incredible filling in the blanks, but also because, as you may know, in Cuba, because of the economic circumstances, there's still the 1950s cars. My grandfather's little farmhouse is not a shopping mall now. Because of the stagnant economy, everything has kind of stayed the same, which is really mind-boggling because you're walking down these same country roads that your father drove down, So it's like this weird, wonderful deja vu in a way. And so that was an amazing experience. Ever since then, I started going back every 3 to 5 years. And it's changed over time. A lot of my cousins and first and second cousins now have moved to Miami over the past 20 years. A lot of the older folks have died. So there's a little bit less of a connection there, a little less of a motivation to go. And I will say also, my family started getting on my nerves in Cuba, so I knew they were family. At some point, I over-romanticize them, and I love them because, yeah, finally, we are real family. But Cuba's an interesting thing because it's emotionally complex because there's always something goes wrong with Cuba. I don't know if you all know, but I also was asked by the State Department to write a poem and read it at the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Cuba, which was like an amazing full circle. And things seemed like we were going to be able to have this connection. And listen, it's not like I want to move to Cuba, but I would like to be able to buy a ticket on kayak and hop over and, see my family or maybe even have a little apartment there someday because I'm still culturally attracted to it. But I've kind of it's gotten more and more distance, and right now I feel like very distant from Cuba, for reasons I'm not sure yet. But I think there might be another moment with me in Cuba.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. One more round of applause for the amazing Richard Blanco.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you all so much for being here and for your generosity, your questions. What a wonderful event. We really loved having you. We hope to see you at 92NY again. This is a place and we hope a creative home for you. And there are some really exciting opportunities coming up here for teens, including an opportunity to continue your writing journey with us this summer, as well as a paid, yes, paid internship opportunity. So my colleague Dylan will be just outside these doors in our Hall of Mirrors with more info and flyers. Thank you so much again for being here with us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Enjoy the sun. Thank you.